another terrible daily death toll here in the UK. And
our objective is to delay and flatten the peak of the epidemic.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson has now been discharged from hospital and
they are confident they have taken the right approach. Of course,
another day, another politician standing at this lectern with bad news to tell.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching The Listening Post. Here are some of the coronavirus stories, the media angles that we're covering from home this week. The casualty figures are climbing in the UK, yet most of the British media are failing to hold the government to account. Locked in with COVID-19. Across the world, prisoners are trying to get their stories out. Israel's Prime Minister decides mass surveillance is the best way to check the spread of the virus. He has a ready-made template to do it. And
so you clap for me now.
A reminder in Britain of a contribution that can no longer be taken for granted. As the coronavirus death toll in the UK continues to mount, there is a growing market for explanations, and it's not being met at 10 Downing Street. Government officials at the daily briefings are dodging difficult questions. Journalists are failing to get answers. Whether that's because of the challenges created when briefings are conducted via video link or an overly respectful press corps that sees itself as part of a collective war against a pandemic, it's meant that politicians have been getting away with vague or incomplete answers on some serious failings, such as the lack of testing, personal protective equipment, and ventilators in a relatively prosperous country. Then there are the questionable decisions that Prime Minister Boris Johnson took in the early stages. Johnson caught the virus, but has recovered. His personal story has received plenty of attention. But how we got here and who is responsible is a larger story, yet to be properly told. Our starting point this week is the site of the UK's daily COVID-19 briefing in Downing Street, London. Press briefings are only as useful as the quality of the questions asked by reporters and answers given by officials.
I don't want to weary you with these opinions. Do you feel that useful? Yes. Good.
Before he tested positive, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, a former journalist turned politician who has casually lied his way through 2 careers, was at the podium, confronted with facts that not even he can fudge: the rising number of infections, the body counts.
Lots of people will be very worried about it. Some people will be much less worried about it. What can you say to them? How many lives might this save?
Then, when Johnson fell ill, his ministers faced questions on the lack of testing and PPE, personal protective equipment, for frontline workers, as well as the larger issue of responsibility. Those questions were slow to come, and many have missed the mark.
I think the journalists who have been at the press briefings could have done a much better job at scrutinising the advisors and the politicians who are addressing us. It would be handy if they had a scientific background, but I don't think you need to have a scientific background to question some of the decisions which have been made. The first job of a journalist is to question.
The entire press conference is kind of organised to be a sort of propaganda exercise. They keep on telling us that they are following the science and producing. The chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer and these other public officials, the ministers to hide behind. And the press, they're having to dial in.
If we go to questions from the media, the first question is from the BBC and HUPIM.
Thank you very much.
It's very hard for them to ask proper follow-up questions. The entire thing is sort of structured in a way that makes press scrutiny incredibly difficult.
The media are being what you might call better behaved than usual. They are being more tolerant and perhaps less questioning of government, because there is a feeling that this is a crisis that no one was expecting, that we all have to do our bit to try and overcome this. So politicians have been given more leeway than they would normally be given.
It's a fake newspaper and they write fake stories.
No one in the UK is calling for the kind of briefing circus coming out of Washington.
Well, we've asked them to accelerate whatever they're doing in terms of a vaccine.
I've never seen a video like that played in this room.
The talking points, shouting points, and presidential media bashing.
You know you're a fake.
That you bought yourself some time and you didn't use it to prepare hospitals, you didn't use it to ramp up testing. Right now, nearly 20 million people
disgraceful.
But the performance of British journalists settling for unclear, incomplete answers from Downing Street falls well short of their reputation for aggressive reporting. And the Johnson government has much to answer for. Its initial half-baked version of social isolation was built around the herd immunity concept and then abandoned. But that took time, many more days of mass exposure and more infections.
In those early days, and I would say sort of from the beginning of March to mid-March, when the policy of the UK government was de facto herd immunity approach.
One of the theories is that, perhaps you could sort of take it on the chin, take it all in one go and allow the disease, as it were, to move through the population.
There wasn't really a robust questioning of that. Robert Peston, the ITV News' political editor, wrote a piece about it. The media did not really question it. Those of us who did question it, we were seen as being more dangerous than the virus itself. Matthew Hancock, the health secretary, has said that journalists who raise questions about that's a distraction, that his job is to save lives, but it's also very, very valid and necessary to ask these difficult questions.
Italian hospitals are at their absolute limit.
Before social distancing was enforced in the UK, the media's focus lay elsewhere, countries in which the numbers were rising fast.
They're fighting a war here and they're losing. The sheer numbers of people succumbing to the coronavirus is overwhelming every hospital in northern Italy.
But as the UK's daily death toll surpassed Italy's, the tone of the reporting was less alarming, more measured, and broadcasters still led with news of Boris Johnson's recovery.
Downing Street says he's sitting up in bed and engaging positively with staff at St Thomas's Hospital.
It's really stark that when the death toll started mounting in Italy, the role of the press, of the media, was so vital in us understanding the scale of the calamity. And yet it has been extraordinary living through the same moment in Britain, where the death toll, you struggle to even see it on the front pages of the newspapers or on the front page of news websites. And the spin which is being put out on a daily basis by the government is instead becoming the headlines and the talking points. There's been a real step change in the last few days, I would say, where the press is becoming more aggressive and we are becoming more alarmed. But it's taken weeks to get to this place.
There has been some aggressive, uncompromising reporting on COVID-19 in the British media. Most of it takes place a long way from the official briefings. On April 11th, after 3 days of rising death tolls and record numbers, The Guardian's front page looked like this. And on the broadcast side, Britons are finding some quality journalism in some unexpected places.
I literally just asked you, is it true that 4,000 elderly people have died in hospital and all you can do is laugh?
Piers Morgan is a former tabloid newspaper editor in the UK who has for some time now been hosting a breakfast program on ITV called Good Morning Britain. And although he has not been particularly well known for his hard-hitting journalism, during this crisis he has consistently been a voice holding government to account.
When you say that we had a plan and you're not prepared to admit any mistakes in that plan, I say that is clearly, self-evidently, ridiculous.
The hospitalization of the Prime Minister was yet another coronavirus angle to cover. 70% of the newspapers sold in the UK tilt Boris Johnson's way, to the political right. Their editorial dilemma? His life was in the hands of the state-funded National Health Service, the NHS, whose funding has been cut by Conservative governments, cuts that those papers have strongly supported. NHS frontline workers are now the toast of Britain. The Conservative papers have had no choice but to jump on that bandwagon. Another public institution that's had its funding cut, the BBC, is watching the NHS story closely. The lockdown has seen the BBC's ratings surge. News programs up 25%. Children's programs up close to 50%. And the Beeb is playing substitute teacher online, educating children who cannot go to school through daily lessons. The NHS and the BBC, as the saying goes, are having a good coronavirus war. But can they survive the peace, if and when it ever comes?
Those arguments, both around the NHS and around the BBC, will come back. I think they've been quietened for now when we see a national response and everybody pulling together. But I think when we emerge on the other side, there might be more support and sympathy for the BBC because there has been some very good reporting.
The staff here are dealing with the biggest challenge ever faced by the NHS.
But I think there has also been very good reporting from other channels, and therefore the underlying issue that there shouldn't be state broadcasting, which is what some of those people that have been trying to undermine the BBC think, I think that will resurface.
What we're seeing at the moment is a great vindication for the power and the importance of traditional mainstream media, particularly public service broadcasters like the BBC. But once we see an end of the pandemic, we're also going to see a significant economic downturn, and the BBC will continue to be under threat. It's unfortunately going to be difficult to continue to protect it, despite the absolutely vital role that is playing as an institution at the moment.
We're discussing other COVID-19 media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Nick Muirhead. Nick, this pandemic is keeping most of us reporters at home. Not nearly enough of us are out there in the field, which means people out there with stories to tell are having to find some novel ways to get those stories out. What kind of ways?
By taking matters into their own hands, Richard. For example, there was a group of female migrants currently incarcerated in Louisiana by the US immigration authorities. They being held 70 to a dorm and were afraid that one of them had contracted the coronavirus and wanted to get the word out. That facility has a video visitation service, so they used it to call a reporter at the Intercept news site, but they knew if they told the reporter their problems, the call could be cut off, so they used handwritten signs instead. One of the guards eventually clued in and the video ends, but by that stage the story had got some coverage, so job done.
The United States has more than 2 million people locked up in its prisons. There must be other stories like this out there.
There are. Just last weekend in Illinois, a reporter from an ABC station in Chicago went to the Cook County jail to cover a reported outbreak in that prison, which has as many as 4,000 prisoners. While they were producing that report, some of the inmates stuck images up in the windows trying to draw the TV crew's attention to their plight, which worked because those images then made it into ABC News's report. But it's not just this prison. There are multiple cases like it, not just in the US, but across the globe.
And some of those prisons have journalists in them behind bars.
They do, and some cases are better known than others. Julian Assange, for example, who is in prison in London's Belmarsh prison. His supporters say that they fear for his health. And just last week, on April 6th, the Committee to Protect Journalists wrote an open letter to African heads of state urging them to release 73 journalists and media workers who are currently in prison. And one of those cases hits close to home. Al Jazeera Mahmoud Hussein is one of 26 journalists in Egypt who are currently in prison. It's been 3 years now, and the Sisi government hasn't even charged him, let alone convicted him of a crime.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Here at The Listening Post, we've been tracking how some governments are using technology, primarily phone data, to monitor the movements of their citizens and to curb the spread of the coronavirus. We've examined some of the long-term implications of that, the concern that even if this pandemic is brought under control, those governments might prove reluctant to give up their new surveillance powers. Israel would be a case in point. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu now has the legal right to surveil Israeli citizens in new ways, and he acquired that right without even consulting Parliament. Israel already has expertise in this field. It has spent decades honing its ability and the technology required to monitor the movements of Palestinians. The Listening Post's Tarek Nafa now reporting from home on the surveillance that Palestinians have been subjected to and whether Israelis can see what's coming.
You must stay at home.
Quite simply, stay at home.
The state has rarely been more present in people's lives, more empowered than it is right now.
This is a war. War on this virus.
Leaders everywhere are using extraordinary measures to combat coronavirus. In Israel, the government is leaning on the security services to provide a security solution to the pandemic. Sending spies to procure medical equipment, tasking a secret biological research center to find a vaccine, and authorizing Israel's domestic security service, the Shin Bet, to spy on all citizens using a vast, previously undisclosed database.
Extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, but these should not be, of course, at the expense of our privacy and our dignity as citizens. In the case of Israel, the Shin Bet, which is an internal intelligence agency, operates in top secrecy, of course, has very little public oversight or accountability, and therefore, this is not the right authority to meddle in such crises.
Israel has been always a militarized society due to its geostrategic historical background. So there is nothing new in the sense that the military and the security services are playing a central role in the Israeli society. Since they have the capabilities and the budgets and the adoration of the civic society, it's no wonder that now they are the most effective tool in combating the virus.
The difference with Israel is that it had in place a template, possibly the most sophisticated in the world. The Israeli military have been surveying Palestinians' movement for decades. And what Netanyahu did was, very early on, he authorized the Secret Service to use their surveillance technologies, not only on Palestinians in the occupied territories, but also on Israeli citizens. And there's a sense, wait a minute, what just happened here?
This is what happens when security services get unrestricted access to phone data about where Israelis go, who they speak to, and what they do online. Contact tracing, using that data to track those who are or could be infected, could help governments ease lockdowns around the world. But the question is how the data is used and by whom. NSO is an Israeli technology firm in the business of surveillance, best known for its hacking software Pegasus. Among its clients, Saudi Arabia. Pegasus was one of the tools the Saudis used in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
הקרונומטר, אני ערב לזה. זאת המערכת הכי טובה שקיימת היום בעולם.
Now, Israel's Minister of Defense wants to put data collected by the state into a so-called coronameter, built by NSO, that grades citizens on their likelihood of spreading the virus.
The NSO group has a tarnished record of human rights. There are numerous stories of journalists and human rights defenders and civil society activists being killed, harassed, surveilled using NSO group spyware and malware. And so companies like these are in no business to deal with people's sensitive health data. They're not just interested in profiting at this moment. Their profit comes, especially NSO, it comes because it whitewashes their reputation, the reputational damage that they've had. It allows them to claim expertise when they next are going to sell their products to other governments. And it literally allows them to use the Israeli citizens as a laboratory.
A mentality of constant war has always existed in Israel. It is a militarized society. For the vast majority of Israelis, military service is mandatory. And the military mindset goes way back. Emergency powers were first used by the British to monitor people, to demolish homes, to restrict free speech and movement. And those powers have been a fixture of Palestinian life since 1948. So Israelis do not have to look very far to see what happens when populations are used as a testing lab.
Palestinians have been exposed to invasive surveillance for decades by the Israeli authorities. Our ICT infrastructure is controlled by Israel, and therefore it has direct access to Palestinians' data. They're collecting information on people's health situation, if someone is having an affair, on sexual orientation, on their financial needs, and in some cases this information has been used to blackmail Palestinians. The surveillance is so invasive that it has become in our DNA as Palestinians that we know that Israel, is this omnipresent power, that it knows everything about us.
The state of emergency has been in place since 1948. So nobody had to declare emergency. It always exists. The only thing that prevents the use of emergency against Israeli citizens is it's a taboo. It's an issue of legitimacy. And once there's legitimacy to survey different types of Israeli citizens because they're being defined as suspicious or as dangerous by the government, then there really is no way to curb that power.
Israeli civil society groups have raised the alarm that the country is venturing into dangerous territory. In the name of national security, Israel's besieged Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ramped up surveillance with virtually no oversight, and at the same time shielded himself from scrutiny by shutting down the courts just as he was about to go on trial for corruption. The pandemic has provided Netanyahu with an opportunity like no other to entrench his rule and silence his critics. And he's taking it.
Every night he's raiding the television studios with his messages.
אנחנו דואגים לכם, אזרחי ישראל. אנחנו עוזרים לכם.
He wants to give the impression that the country cannot do without him. He is the savior of the nation. Only he can save Israel and its people from this terrible calamity.
היכולת שלנו להגיב במהירות ובגמישות על אתגר הקורונה מעוררת הערכה במדינות רבות. ישראל בהרבה דברים הפכה למודל.
He has been in power for 11 years. He didn't win the last 3 elections, and still he is manipulating the situation to concentrate even more power in his hands.
The pandemic will pass. Sooner or later, it will pass. But these deployed tools, surveillance tools, infrastructures, the fear is that these will continue with us for a longer time. And if history taught us one thing, post 9/11, is that these technologies can really shift our world, can shift our digital ecosystem. Fighting the pandemic is one thing, but we should not sacrifice our privacy as a price for it. And we should not be put in a corner where we have to choose between our privacy or our health.
And finally, every Thursday night in the UK at 8 p.m., people open up their windows or step outside their doors to applaud the frontline workers in this pandemic, including healthcare workers. And there's an irony in that, because this pandemic intersects with another major news story in Great Britain, one that was charged with xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, the Brexit story. Migrant workers make up a large part of the National Health Service. They're saving British lives. So a London-based creative producer named Sachini Imbuldania recruited some of those workers, all first, second, or third generation immigrants, to recite a poem called You Clap for Me Now. It's a simple yet powerful reminder of the contribution that we can all make to a society, wherever we are and wherever we come from. We'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
So, it's finally happened.
That thing you were afraid of.
Something's come from overseas
and taken your jobs.
made it unsafe to walk the streets,
kept you trapped in your home.
A dirty disease.
Your proud nation gone.
But not me.
Or me.
Or me.
Or me.
No, you clap for me now.
You cheer as I toil.
bringing food to your family,
bringing food from your soil,
propping up your hospitals.
Not some foreign invader.
A delivery driver,
teacher,
lifesaver.
Don't say go home. Don't say not here.
You know how it feels for home to be a prison.
You know how it feels to live in fear.
So you clap for me now.
All this love you are bringing.
But don't forget when it's no longer quiet.
Don't forget when you can no longer hear the birds singing.
Or see clearer waters that I cross for you.
To make lives filled with peace.
And bring peace to your life too.
Come, all you Gretas.
You Malalas.
You immigrants.
See what we have learned.
It only takes the smallest thing
to change the world.